Dobrý den, welcome to today's press conference. My name is Misha Glenny. I am the chair of the Committee for Editorial Independence, and we are in the Ekonomia building in Prague today. And we are here to present the results of a poll that we, along with the IPI, the International Press Institute, commissioned together, called Attitudes to Media Freedom and Independence in Central Europe. When we commissioned this poll, we were concerned already with the state of media freedom in Central Europe, but also elsewhere in the European Union. I can say from my own personal experience, because although I'm an Irish citizen, I'm also a British citizen, I lived through the Brexit campaign in the United Kingdom, where, of course, the result was very close in the end. But the printed media in the United Kingdom was 80% in favor of Brexit and 20% against Brexit. So that had a very significant political outcome and proved to me that encouragement and preservation of media freedom is absolutely critical. But since we commissioned this poll, a couple of other things have happened. First of all, of course, in late February, there was the Russian invasion of Ukraine and all the issues surrounding information, disinformation regarding the conflict. And we've also had an election in Hungary, which we're going to talk about later on. But even more, yesterday we heard the news late on that Elon Musk is going to buy Twitter. Now, Elon Musk, of course, is the richest person in the world. The idea that the richest person in the world should control the most significant social medium, which is used by politicians, journalists, academics, military people, ordinary people, everyone imaginable around the world, that power should be in the hands of one man who's fantastically rich, is something that we believe adds further urgency to what we have discovered in our poll of Central Europeans in the 4 Visegrád states, which we'll go into more detail about. I'm pleased to say that on our panel is a colleague of mine from the committee, Vasilev, who has worked tirelessly to get this poll underway and also to interpret the results. The headline is that citizens across Central Europe are worried about the state of media freedom in their countries, and they are also very concerned that something be done about this, in particular in legislative form, i.e. that guarantees are given that media freedom continues to flourish and exist in Central Europe. It is coincidental, but it's important that when the Czech Republic takes over the European Union presidency in July, this will coincide with Věra Jourová's draft bill on media freedom for the European Union. This is going to be a very significant event. Politics at the moment in Europe and around the world are extremely dangerous and extremely polarized. And media freedom is absolutely critical, in my opinion, if we're going to meet the challenges posed to us. So, first of all, I want to introduce, I'm very pleased to introduce Veronika Munk. Veronika is the founding editor-in-chief of Telex in Hungary, an online portal which, despite countless pressures, preserves its independence and gives the people of Hungary decent, objective news. She's now head of content development there. And I'd like to ask Veronica, you can stay sitting, Veronica, you don't have to stand up like me, ask Veronica what her experiences are in Hungary, because we know that Hungary is a critical country with regard to media freedom and politics in Central Europe at the moment. Veronica, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Misha. I hope my mic is working, right? Okay. Yeah, I'm coming from a country where the media sphere is extremely affected by politics. I already know the data that will be presented a little bit later. I was not really surprised that how unique the Hungarian media sphere is, how divided the Hungarian media sphere by politics. The majority of the Hungarian media outlets somehow belong to people who have strong connections to the politicians, and there are less and less media outlets, basically only online, which are still critical and independent of it. And the Hungarian public media is basically a megaphone of the government, and the advertisement market is also heavily influenced by politics. And in our everyday life, it's really, really hard to access information, because sometimes we are not allowed to go into press conferences, or our requests, our journalistic requests, our questions are not answered. So now this is the situation in a nutshell, but I'd like to emphasize that how quickly things can change. I have been worked as a journalist in Hungary in the last 2 decades. And I was already a political journalist in Hungary, where the situation was something like now in Finland. If you see the Reporters Without Borders Index, which is published every year, the Freedom of Press Index, in 2006, Hungary was 10th out of 160-something countries. Now we are 92nd. And it was like 15 years ago. So from this data, you can see that basically you just close your eyes and things completely change. And the everyday life as a journalist completely change in your country. So I think that could be an important agenda and important message to all of the region, or basically for all of the world, that you need to be aware that the situation can seem to be stable, but can change very quickly.
And Veronica, what does this do to public opinion and public attitudes if they aren't getting access to decent information?
If in a country's government the clear media strategy is to own the media, therefore to spread the governmental political messages for the wide audience, then it affects on the public opinion. I think we could see it in the election results. Of course, it's not just about the media sphere in Hungary, because there were several other economical factors, or the current war in the neighboring Ukraine. But I do think that owning the large majority of the media field affect on how people think about anything in the country. So yes, I do think if we think about this last election, which happened 3 weeks ago, the ownership structure of the media and the political influence on it had a large affection.
Yes, so we've seen this in many parts of the European Union, in fact, and including in the United Kingdom. We see various tools which try and constrain freedom of the press. There are the so-called SLAPs, which are strategic lawsuits, i.e. you tie up newspapers or journalists in complex and expensive court cases for a long time, which hinders their work. There is the issue of government advertising and governments discriminating against publications which they don't like. I want to turn now briefly to Michal Klima, who, when we started this poll, I think you were still, when we were first discussing it, you were still working for the IPI. Since then, you've been appointed a government commissioner for media and for countering disinformation. Couple of words from you, Michal, on the poll and the general state of media freedom.
Does it work? Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Economia media company that they decided to finance this survey. It is very important to have feedback from the society, how people feel about the importance of independent media, and results of it are very interesting and very satisfying. You will see it later. The support for independent media, especially in our country, in the Czech Republic, is extremely high, and it is very important for politicians also. You know that last year, or before last year, we were on the track to follow Hungary in the media situation, but this was changed because Mr. Babiš, the owner of the big media tycoon, and at the same time the prime minister and head of the biggest party, was defeated by the current pro-democratic coalition. And it brought really the change of the situation. Before elections, the government rejected access of many media to information, access to press conferences, and this is all over. Nowadays, every journalist from every media can get information he or she needs and has access to press conferences. I would also like to find some way how the government can more support media, because in many Western countries, the traditional Western countries, the support of media exists by governments. In the former communist countries, it doesn't exist, and this is something which, according to my opinion, should be changed, because the media situation, and especially situation of the new media, which started at the moment when Mr. Babiš overtook the biggest media. So the situation of this media is really critical, especially at least many of them, and their existence is important for democracy. And my opinion is that the government should agree on that and accept some way of support. I don't mean support of individual media, but support of the industry generally, because of course I understand that it is not possible for the political power to select media which will be supported according political preferences, but there are many ways, as I said, which are used in traditional Western countries, how media should be supported, and I hope we will find a way in our country as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michal. And that raises a very important question, which is the issue of public service broadcasting. Again, from my experience in the United Kingdom, where we have one of the traditionally very best public broadcast services, the BBC, we are very concerned in the United Kingdom about attempts by the present government, or intentions of the present government, to dismember the BBC and to hand over news provision to private companies. So it's something that I'm certainly very, very concerned about. Before we get to the substance of the poll results with Václav Štětka, I'd like to ask Václav Pecha to say a couple of words from the Bacala Foundation, who helped us with the funding of the poll.
Thank you, Misha, and thank you for organizing this, and big kudos go to Ms. Schreibova and Václav, who spent countless hours on getting where we are. From our post and small edit, we ended up as a foundation financing this, and we did it gladly for a couple of reasons. Support for media is one of our founding stones as a foundation. We've been doing that for a while. This is one of the ways of doing it. And as you mentioned, governments don't necessarily support media. Sometimes it does fall on the NGO sector, and that's what we as a foundation did. And in the times when we are all facing the algorithmization of truth, as you mentioned, and the attack on free media, this is super important. And the data coming out of it will essentially, not only will we treat it as a public good and we'll offer it to anyone who wants to further work with it, but it also serves as a benchmark for politicians, for policymakers, and also for organizations that do support media, because you can finally have something that is data-driven. It's not something assumed. That's actually, there are real data showing you what needs to be done. Obviously, especially with the outliers of Poland and Hungary, which I will obviously let Václav to talk about. So those are the underlying reasons why we decided to support this, and we encourage everyone to take a deep look at it, because there's some seriously disconcerting traits, especially in the countries that I've already mentioned. So again, thank you to the organizers, and I guess I hand it to the most important person here in the room.
Václav, the floor is yours. Give us put the meat on the bones.
Thank you, Misha, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming here or being with us online. It is my pleasure to present selected findings from our poll on the attitudes to media freedom and independence in Central Europe. First, a few words about the overall aim of the poll and methodology. So why did we do it in the first place? Well, the short answer is that because it has never been done yet in this format, in this region, in a comparative framework. We have a lot of data, as a matter of fact, and you know about them, from various organizations, journalistic associations, NGOs, media observers, that are producing reports pretty much annually. So we know what the state of media freedom is in these countries, but we don't really know what the public thinks about media freedom. How much do they value media independence, how much they do support it, and whether or not they are in favor of some specific practical measures to protect it. So that's why this poll has been commissioned. It has been driven by those following research questions, which you can see on the screen. So broadly, what is the people's assessment of the current state of media freedom in their country, how much they are concerned about the threats to media freedom, what is people's perceived importance of independent journalism, and finally, but perhaps most importantly, what do people think that should be done in order to protect media freedom and support independent journalism. So the research has been commissioned by our Committee for Editorial Independence, and the data was collected by the Median polling agency in cooperation with its local partners, and the data was collected in the first half of February. So let's go to the selected results, starting with people's perception of the state of media freedom. So as you can see, overall, there's divisions among the countries in the way people see the current state of media freedom. The Czech Republic is the country where most people view media freedom as, or media in their country as relatively free. 47% of the population thinks that. On the other side or on the other end of the spectrum is Hungary, with only 30% of people who believe that media are essentially free. These results are affected to a certain extent by social demographic factors, unsurprisingly perhaps. So interestingly though, young people tend to see media freedom as relatively, tend to see media as relatively more free than the older generation. And when we look at the differences among the size of people's domiciles or locations, we see that in bigger cities there's more polarization. About the same percentage of people think that media are free as the ones that think that media are not free. But perhaps more interestingly, there are substantial differences based on people's political preferences, affiliations. So we looked at the assessment of media freedom based on which parties people voted for in the last elections. And this is just a snapshot from the results showing that people who in Hungary voted for Fidesz or Poland voted for Law and Justice Party, so the government parties, they tend to think that the media are more free than the general population, which is perhaps unsurprising. And that doesn't really count for, or the same cannot be really said about the voters of ANO party. They are very much on the average. So most people think that their state of media freedom in their country is worse than the state of media freedom elsewhere in Central and Eastern Europe, and except for Czech Republic, where people are more divided or unsure when comparing media freedom with their neighbors. Just skipping to, again, party affiliations, this is a question about how people perceive the change of media freedom over the last 5 years. And again, we see the same pattern. Voters of the government parties in Poland and Fidesz think that more of them think that media freedom has improved over the course of the last 5 years, rather than those who think it has worsened. Voters of the formerly governing party in Czech Republic, ANO, think that actually media freedom has worsened over the course of the last 5 years. I'm not sure if it reflects just those few months of the last few months when ANO has been out of the government, but it's actually an interesting result. So now to the perhaps most important part of the survey: how concerned are people about the state of media freedom? So it turns out that the majority of the population across those 4 countries are expressing concerns about the current state of media freedom, 52% on average, but with quite a substantial differences across the countries. The Poles are the most concerned with about 63%. The Czechs on the opposite side of the spectrum with 47%, but still significantly more than those who are not expressing concern. And again, this data is driven, these findings are driven by social demographic factors. Younger people tend to express relatively less concern. It's the older people, older generations, who tend to be more concerned overall across those countries. Again, there is very significant and interesting impact of political affiliations. Governing parties in Poland, in Hungary, Fidesz and PiS, are expressing much less concern about the state of media freedom. On the other hand, the parties that until recently have been in opposition in Czech Republic are generally more more concerned. Although when we look at the party SPD, the far right party in the Czech Republic, they are actually the ones most concerned, which I think invites some additional explanations. Perhaps they are generally unsatisfied with the state of so-called mainstream media, and this is what is reflected by the poll. The idea or the general support for having independent media is very high across all the countries. So people are very much in agreement about the fact that there should be independent media. The highest percentage in the Czech Republic, 86%, but even actually in Hungary, 72% of population think that it is important for democracy to have independent media. But of course, the question is, what do people think that independent media entails? And that's where we run into interesting differences, because we asked about certain specific factors that are broadly associated with media freedom and independence, like the role of the owners. We ask people whether they agree that that media owners should have a right to decide what their journalists should write about or talk about. In other words, whether they should be free to interfere with the content of their media. And quite a lot of people in Hungary actually believe that should be the case, 23%, which is more than in most other countries. Although in general we can be perhaps satisfied with the results, because most people believe that owners should not have this power over the media. We also asked people if they think that the government should interfere with the content of public service media. And again, Hungary is on the is a bit of an outlier, because the highest percentage of people who think that government should be able to dictate the content of public service media is found in Hungary. Moving on to the question of what should be done about media freedom. How should media freedom be protected and safeguarded? Well, again, interesting results for us in terms of the broad support for the state to strengthen legislation to protect media freedom and independence. 71% on average, but actually there's not too many differences across the countries. In Hungary it's a little bit less, but generally there is a broad support for the state to strengthen legislation to protect media freedom. Not so many people are supportive of the idea that the state should support the media by economic means. So they do favor legislation, strengthening of legislation, but not so much economic support. Although in Poland, that's one outlier, almost half of the population would agree to the state supporting free media by, for example, tax reliefs or direct subsidies. And finally, and perhaps most surprisingly to us all, the results concerning people's agreement with the role of the EU. Majority of population across those all countries agree that the EU should have powers to sanction or impose penalties on governments that are interfering with media freedom. So there is actually an interesting momentum that people are perhaps becoming aware that this is not just a matter of the national states, but it's a matter for the EU to do something to protect media freedom. So that was just a short snapshot. More results full results are available on our website, including a full version of these slides. So thank you for now for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion, which I'm sure we're going to have.
Václav, that was terrific. Thanks very much indeed. And there's a lot to absorb from those lessons. I was particularly struck, as you were, by that last one about there being support for the EU to intervene in terms of defending media freedom. Before we go over to questions, I want to introduce our final guest, who actually in this audience probably doesn't need much introduction. Robert Jasensky is one of the Czech Republic's best investigative journalists and is now vice chair, is that right, of the IPI here in Prague. Robert.
Thank you for inviting me here. It's a big honor to be among all those panelists. When I saw the result of this poll, it came to my mind 2 or 3 questions, which I would like to address to Václav. The first one, I'm sorry that I'm already questioning you before the question started, but the first one is how people says that they support the legislation changes to protect the media freedom. How they think it could be guarded by the legislation? Do they have some concrete ideas, or it's just a spoken word like there should be some strong strengthening of legislation? That would be one of my questions. And the second is, would we have in, let's say, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years from now, some and other results going to that direction, because I would see as a very important to work with this data and these questions for a longer period. As here was mentioned, in Hungary situation changed dramatically in last 15 years. I admire Michal's optimism that in Czech Republic it changed dramatically to the better. I would remind that if you as a government want to make some steps, please think that your government will not last forever, and we can count that the next one or the over next one maybe would not be such a favor to the media freedom. So I would like to ask Václav how they people think that media freedom should be protected in concrete steps.
I wish I had an answer to that question, but sadly, our poll could not possibly have gone into such a depth to ask about specific measures. We just asked the question, general question, whether people agree that the state should adopt legislation or strengthen legislation to protect media freedom and independence, and we got these positive results, but we didn't ask about the particular steps to be taken. So I don't know exactly what people had in mind when answering the question. Perhaps if we answered or if we gave them more options, the results might be slightly different. But I think that on this general level, it's quite heartening to see that people are somehow aware of the fact that something should be done. But I would very much second and support your suggestion for repeating this survey in a few years' time. As a researcher, I'm always in favor of longitudinal data. I think it would be really useful to repeat this, and that's perhaps a question to be addressed to the funder or to other people who might want to support this initiative.
Thanks very much. And Robert, obviously this is a very important question. It's going to be, again, I reiterate, extremely interesting when Vice President of the European Commission, Věra Jourová, presents her media freedom bill at the beginning of July, to see exactly what concrete steps she believes can be done in order to do this. I suspect she will be concentrating on slaps, amongst other things, on government advertising, but also, as we've seen in Poland, there's the issue of foreign media ownership and media ownership in general. But I agree with you. I mean, it's going to be a difficult conundrum, a difficult puzzle, this one, as to what measures you actually introduce. So let's have a close look at that when that happens in July. Thanks very much for those presentations by the panelists, and I'd like to pass it on to the floor now if anyone has any questions for specific panelists. Please go ahead. Robert.
Yes.
And can you introduce yourself? I beg your pardon, and your...
Yes, good morning. Robert Tate here from The Guardian. I wanted to address a question to Veronica Munk. As you mentioned, Fidesz recently won a landslide fourth election victory, a fourth term for Viktor Orbán. Do you anticipate or fear that that will lead to an even worse situation in Hungary for the remaining independent, critical media? Or indeed, is it possible for the situation to get any worse?
Thank you for the question. Being so close to this last election, only 3 weeks, we are only 3 weeks after, it's really hard to predict what's going to happen. I always thought it's not possible that the situation is getting worse, but I was surprised many times in the last decade. So unfortunately, I cannot give you a concrete answer. Of course, I mean, the role of the EU can be really important regarding this matter, because there is this rule of law mechanism against Hungary. And of course, freedom of press is a large part of it. So we will see if the EU have real and concrete something against my country, then it can affect for the media situation as well. Or the government could think that, okay, this is a very good strategy, and they continue to do it even in a more serious, more in-depth ways. In terms of the legislative field, Fidesz got more than 2/3 of the parliament seats, so basically they can do anything. So it's very nice to hear that the public opinion in Hungary suggests that somehow the state could protect freedom of press in Hungary as well. But we did not see that in the last decade or so, that they willing to do it. So the short answer is, I think it's really hard to predict what's going to happen. Sorry that I cannot be more precise on that.
I think if I may add to that, Robert, there are two other countries which are worth discussing in this context. One is Poland and the other is Slovenia. Janez Janša, the former Prime Minister of Slovenia, had begun to undermine media freedom. This is according both to a parliamentary commission from the European Parliament and according to journalists inside Slovenia. But he had not gone nearly as far as the Orban government had done in Hungary. And we note from the elections last Sunday, somewhat overshadowed by the French presidential election, that Janša suffered a really crushing defeat. Now, is this partially because of the greater media freedom that existed in Slovenia as opposed to Hungary? We can't tell for sure, but I certainly think it's a factor that one ought to consider. The other issue is since the war in Ukraine, as we've noticed, relations between Poland and the European Union have improved for a variety of reasons, obviously the Ukraine situation being foremost amongst them, whereas rhetoric towards the Orban government has sharpened from the European Union. I do hope that the European Union doesn't forget that the situation in Poland with regard to media freedom is very disturbing still. And in particular, you see the use of SLAPs, the strategic lawsuits designed to suppress press freedom. The use of SLAPs is particularly common in Poland, as is the whole debate around foreign ownership of the media. So I don't want us to go away from this press conference thinking that Hungary is the only country with a problem here, because it's not, although I think Veronica's original message of this can happen really quickly is very important.
May I add one
Yes.
quick thing? That we were I was talking a lot about the ownership structure in my country and how the difficult access to information is. But I'd like to add one more thing, which was one of the new surprising things, is the surveillance of journalists by an Israeli spy software called Pegasus, which was purchased by the Hungarian state. So when you were asking that the situation can be possible worse, and I said that I was surprised and surprised again, that one example that happened in the last year when it became obvious that not just critical journalists but other oppositional politicians or businessmen who had oppositional opinions, political opinions, were somehow surveillance by Pegasus. So I think that's also a very worrying aspects of this whole situation.
Veronica, I'm really pleased that you raised the issue of Pegasus, because this has been so disturbing. In fact, we discovered in the United Kingdom recently that Pegasus has been installed on phones of civil servants in number 10 Downing Street and the Foreign Office as well. This is a deeply, deeply disturbing development, and one where I think legislation really is urgently required. Any other questions? Tessa, and then three. We can. No, Tessa, you can go first.
Hi, my name is Tessa Szyszkowicz. I'm an Austrian journalist in London. I find it super interesting that we are discussing here, obviously, the problems in Hungary and other countries that were formerly under the communist regimes. But it's, for me, very interesting, and I wonder if we could also ask the panel to comment on how quickly media freedom goes down in Western countries when certain right-wing populist governments come into power. Because we see, Misha was elegantly pointing at this a little bit, in the United Kingdom now we have a situation where the BBC is severely under pressure, and where financing is questions and everything. So before democratic institutions are dismantled, the media is the first victim and starts being under pressure. We have seen this in Austria under the previous government, that the ORF was immediately under pressure from the government to the financing was questioned. And so I would wonder if you could maybe comment on how fragile it's not only in a situation where for long years in Hungary a government is trying to get media under control, but how quickly that goes in the West too.
Well, I could talk all day about the United Kingdom, but I'm not sure if it would be of much value. The one thing I'd say, and then I'll ask anyone else to comment, is that what struck me when I was covering the wars in the former Yugoslavia is you did have elections all the time in the constituent republics in Yugoslavia. And the minute that an election was held, if there was an incoming government, and sometimes governments changed, sometimes they formed a coalition of some sort, there were two posts which were immediately appointed as essentially being subordinate to the government. The first was the head of customs, and the second was the head of television and radio. Those were the two critical instruments in maintaining control and financial control during Yugoslavia, and to an extent that was the case in some other East European countries as well. I can't really talk in detail about the models of other countries, but does anyone else have experience? So no, sadly, Tessa, we can't help you there. But it's not to say that we're not unaware of the issue. We're aware of the issues of media ownership in France, for example, which I would be interested in looking more closely at that. And it's also worth looking at those countries where public service broadcasting works well. I would imagine Scandinavia is included in that, but I can't talk with any authority. Lady over there.
Thank you. I'm Lucia Sikorová. I'm representing Association of Online Publishers and European Center for Press and Media Freedom. I would like to follow up on Robert's question. And so this research didn't ask citizens how exactly the government should strengthen the legislation. But I would be curious to hear your recommendation. So a question both on Misha Gleny and Václav Štětka. What would you recommend to the Czech government how to support media freedom? What concrete steps should be done? What would be the most important? Thank you.
I think we could also ask.
I think
Michal
exactly.
Klima.
We have a representative from the government in charge of this area. So I will gladly yield.
I want to be advised.
Well, I think that we didn't ask about the legislative instruments to be implemented, but one of the things that is broadly recommended, not just for Central Eastern Europe, but for Europe in general, is for the state to encourage a creation of an economically favorable environment. That can mean for the media. That can mean, of course, direct subsidies or some form of direct support, but it can also mean indirect support in form of, for example, tax reliefs, or various types of improving the legal situation of journalists or employment status of journalists. So there's a variety of things that can be adopted. Unfortunately, if you look at the results of the poll, we don't see too much of a support for direct subsidies from the population. But as I said, it's not the only way, and perhaps it also invites the government to educate people a little bit more about what it actually means, and that it's not such a strange thing to do for the government to be involved in the business of journalism, providing that we agree that journalism is a public good. It's something that democratic society should protect and foster an environment in which this journalism can flourish.
I want to say one thing, and that is what is special in the Czech Republic, and that is missing discussion in media on media affairs. Because what we are missing is really discussion going on in media about the legislation, about the situation of media, all the media affairs. I tell you, and this is not new. This is really missing for the whole 32 years of our freedom. I tell you one story which happened maybe 25 years ago when I was the president of Czech Publishers Association, and at the time we had a big problems with the distribution system for newspapers, and there was a struggle with the government how the distribution system should work and so on. And we created a big event about it, a press conference, and we brought the president of the World Association of Newspapers, Timothy Bolding, who came to Prague from Paris, and he took part at the discussion, at the press conference, and we also arranged for him a big interview with Mladá Fronta, a daily newspaper, the biggest newspaper, the biggest quality newspapers in the country. So I took him to the room where there was the editor of the financial department of the newspaper, and they spent about 50 minutes there, and then Timothy came to me and said, "I am absolutely surprised because for the whole time he did not ask me about the distribution system." And when it was finished, and he said that he thanks me, so I asked him, "And what about the distribution system? I came here to speak about the distribution system, and you asked me about everything, but not about the distribution system." And he explained to me, said Timothy, the journalist from Mladá Fronta Dnes, he explained to me that in the Czech Republic you do not write about media affairs because you think that it's a conflict of interest. And I told, and Timothy Bolding told me, traveled all over the world. I met journalists all over the world. This is the only country where I hear that to write about media affairs is a conflict of interest, and that the Czech media are not writing about that. So this is something missing, because if the media are not discussing the media problem, who would do it? Yeah.
I'd just add on in terms of what you can do. We did have a model, and we have had a model in the United Kingdom for the BBC, which worked very well, where editorial independence was guaranteed. The organisation was at arm's length from the government. It was funded by a TV license system. And whilst there are serious arguments to be had about whether a TV license system in the age of the internet is still appropriate, I think it's also worth reminding people that in the United Kingdom you pay roughly 180 euros, 145 pounds or so per year for a BBC license. If you want to subscribe to Sky and Netflix alone, particularly if you're a sports fan and you get Sky Sports, you're talking about 500 euros a year for those two alone. If you add on Apple and Amazon and so on and so forth, you're realizing that you're going to be paying a hell of a lot of money for broadcast services which don't necessarily include news programs, and certainly has no guarantee of being objective news programs, because it's up to the whim of the owner, essentially. And that's why public broadcasting is so very important, and the struggle for the BBC is one which actually is important for other countries in Europe, notwithstanding our departure from the European Union. You wanted to...
Hello, I'm David Basel from Hospodářské noviny, here from Economia. I have a question for Veronika Munk. When I saw the data first, I couldn't help but think myself, there is a little Hungarian schizophrenia there. Because when we talk about the data, people think that they should have freedom of media. They should protect the media. There should be an economic sanctions on governments who impose some threats on the media. But then we saw the elections last month, and it was a landslide victory of Viktor Orbán, who does exactly that. What people fear of that. Could you just comment on that particular thing, that how it's like, how it could be even done? Then people think one thing and then do the other.
I saw a little bit differently the data, because I could see how divided the Hungarian public opinion regarding this matter. So especially if you see the data compared to the surrounding V4 countries, I could see, and this is this bipolar attitudes towards public opinion and regarding the media state is affects basically every aspect of the Hungarian public sphere. So what I could see, that basically half of the people and the voters as well thinks that freedom of press, media pluralism, editorial independence is really important. The other part thinks differently because of the political message they got from the governmental propaganda. Yes, the Fidesz had 2/3 of the parliament, but it doesn't mean that this is 2/3 of the Hungarian voters. The Hungarian voting system is a really unique one, and it was restructured in the last couple of years, and it's favoring the current government. Therefore, we cannot say that 2/3 of the Hungarians support the current government, but we can say that by the Hungarian electoral system, with this number of votes, which something like 3 million people, they can get the 2/3 of the parliamentary seats. So wouldn't use the word schizophrenia for this, but I could say that this is this bipolar system or bipolar attitudes in the Hungarian state of mind.
Václav.
Yeah, I just wanted to answer this with regards to the data and the more in-depth look into what we have there, because it does strike an interesting observation that the Hungarian average, national average, with regards to the response of on the media independence is different from the rest of the countries. But I would also like to highlight that there's a big difference when you ask the Fidesz voters about their attitudes to things like media ownership role or the role of the government with regards to public service television. So only 35% of Fidesz voters think that the government should not have the right to interfere with the content of public service television, and about the same percentage don't think that there is anything strange or anything wrong with media owners being involved in the content of the news. So in other words, when we look at the Fidesz voters, they certainly have a different perception of what independent media means, what this value actually entails. So for them, clearly there isn't really much of a conflict between independent media and the state interference or media ownership interference. They simply have very different view on what media autonomy and independence means.
And just one short comment. Media literacy and education is really important. And basically, media literacy studies is not present in the Hungarian elementary schools. I have two kids who are in elementary school, so I have experience as a parent as well, and they have nothing. And if people do not understand what independency means, what editorial independence means, what freedom of press means, or they do care because we see in the data, but we do not know what they think as a definition of it. And we had this experience at Telex that if we use the word in Hungarian independency or we use independent media, it's not our audience do not react very well. So therefore we use impartiality, we use fairness, we use curiosity, we use critical thinking, and therefore they can understand more what what fact-based journalism means for us. So somehow education is a more important or the most important factor of the possible changes in the future.
Thank you, Veronica. Any more? Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry to jumping in the discussion, but I think we came to the most important part of this discussion, because the meaning what the independence of media means is very different to Fidesz voters and to opposition voters, is very different in Czech Republic to SPD voters and others. I think that completely other point of view has this part of society than the other one, and everyone is concerned about the media freedom, but they are concerned about the media freedom in their perception, in how they feel it. And I think if we, as are sitting here, can do something on that, we should take the role to explain what the real media independence is, because I think that this could be the role of medias, as Michal mentioned it, to work on their own future, to really show what the independence journalism means, what the critical journalism means, and that journalists are not the fans of such one party of another. Journalists are not the promoters of this political way or that political way. And I think this is the very important role of media itself, to talk about the media freedom, to think about the media freedom, and to explain what real media freedom means, because otherwise we will have interesting datas, but with not not common for everyone who is answering it in these polls. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Griffin Rosell. I'm the press officer and spokesperson at the U.S. Embassy. I think we've started to touch on this. My question is for Mr. Klima, but I'd love to hear from the rest of the group. At least in the Czech Republic and Slovakia, anti-system voters, SPD and Kotlebovci, they are most concerned about media freedom, and they are probably also most likely consuming conspiracy media, disinformation. And so my question is, how do we, as professionals and as policymakers, square this idea of trying to combat and counter disinformation, especially foreign disinformation, with also supporting media freedom, when those voters will perceive that as an attack on media freedom?
Well, we are just now discussing this after the start of the war of Russia against Ukraine. This is everybody, even more people see that this is important discussion. The group of lawyers in the Ministry of Interior are trying to find the wording of the law which should define how to define disinformation and how to deal with the sources which are spreading this. Because I had some discussions with politicians, I can say that they are very much afraid not to endanger the media freedom, which is of course very good. I like that they have this feeling, but on the other hand, we must somehow to differ. What is the freedom of speech, freedom of expressing opinions, and what is really the act of the foreign government which is trying to disinform and influence the public opinion in a foreign country. And I think this, according to my opinion, should not be included under the defense of the freedom of expression.
I just wanted to say that you are right, that's something that comes from the data. The anti-system parties in Czech Republic and Slovakia expressed the most concern, but I don't think somehow we can change it dramatically by any means, any policy initiatives. I mean, we can win some of those voters perhaps, but I think that there will still always be a certain percentage of the population that will be distrustful of the so-called mainstream media or mainstream political scene. And I think the aim is just to minimize that percentage, but we cannot possibly think that we can be successful in turning them all around.
But there are some mechanisms which are being introduced to address this issue now. Again, I don't want to go on to the BBC about the BBC a great deal because I don't work for the BBC, but I admire it. Although the BBC fell into a very, very bad trap over two issues, climate change and Brexit, where instead of they were so frightened politically and intimidated that instead of investigating and examining claims made by either sides on the Brexit and the climate change debate, they would just say, well, here we have a spokesman for 99.9% of the world's scientists, and here we have Nigel Lawson, a failed government minister who happens to be a conspiracy theorist on, except they didn't mention that he was a conspiracy theorist on climate change. And so it was, on the one hand you have this, on the other hand you have that, but it was actually not representative of the provable evidential fact. So what the BBC, and the same thing happened on Brexit, what the BBC has now done is they have a disinformation correspondent and they have a fact-checking unit inside the BBC. Now, fact-checking is something that American media have used for a very long time, print media in particular, which was never a thing in the United Kingdom, and in our country you could write whatever you want without really giving too much regard to the facts. But I think it's a welcome thing that you start to have a culture of fact-checking of claims made by politicians or other interested parties, so that they are not just reproduced blindly, as it were. So that's one mechanism. I'm sure that there are others. I mean, Vasilev will know there are a lot of people who are working on this issue now and trying to come up with ways to combat disinformation. Governments, I think, will have to get involved at some point. Any more questions?
Hello, I have a question that came online through Slido. It's from Martin Luhan from Rekonstrukce státu, and he's asking, surprising results, mainly in the Czech Republic, low support for financial subventions, support for changes in national laws, and huge support for EU intervention. Explanations?
Yeah, I think it might reflect the general perception on the side of the public that basically the state should stay out of media business. That's something that has been held not just by public but by state or politicians and media themselves for a long time. We've never had a culture of state support for media in this country, unlike many other European countries, as a matter of fact. And I think that one of the challenges for the government is to convince people that this is something normal, that there are established schemes for support, either direct or indirect support, in actually most European countries, and that should be normalized. Also, I would like to add that we've seen this unfortunate situation during the COVID crisis when, again, many European countries established and launched some form of subsidy, some form of scheme that supported the media that were heavily affected by the economic crisis stemming from COVID, but nothing happened in Czech Republic. So again, there's a big gap between what's going on in Europe and what's going on here, and I think that people just need to become aware that this is something normal.
Any other questions? Yes, Vasilev, of course.
Thank you. I'm going to, if I may, just come back to the beginning.
Sure.
There are kind of two unanswered questions, and I want to take that not as a promise to everyone here, but I understand that doing this as a one-off is just a drop in a bucket, and then we have really nothing to compare it to. So we've already talked about maybe repeating this, and so I'll be happy to work with Media and Vasilev again on improving and taking some of some of the interesting questions as to how best kind of shape the questions. So that's a commitment on our side. And then I think Tessa asked an important question. I know we don't have an answer to it, but I thought of something. And it's, I feel like who owns Twitter will really decide the next elections in the United States. And the elections in the United States will essentially, I think, decide a lot of other things. So you will see both of the parties cozying up to Elon Musk as the deal is done, And then, second most, the richest man owns the Washington Post. And then you go down, the 6th or 7th owns the Google, and the 10th owns Bloomberg. So, I mean, we see what, and just because you own it doesn't mean that you will play for one or the other side. You need an independent board, such as Economia has. So we'll see what happens, but essentially it will be interesting what happens in the next, 20 to 30 months in the United States with it. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Vasilev. Very good point. Okay, well, I want to thank all of our panelists, Vasilev, Robert, Michal, and Veronica, who's come from Budapest for this event. So thank you very much to you. Thanks very much for being here, and thanks to everyone who've been watching online. Thanks to the IPI and to Economia. It's been a pleasure.